23,000 years ago, where the Bering Sea sits today, there was no sea at all. The oceans were more than 100 meters, roughly 330 feet, lower than they are now. In their place was open land, cold, vast, and windswept, stretching between two continents that are separated by water today. And across that land, a small group of people were moving south into territory no human being had ever entered, toward a continent they had no idea existed. The world they were walking through was not the world we know. Global temperatures were several degrees colder. Ice sheets rose on the southern horizon like walls built by the planet itself, 3 kilometers tall, that is nearly 2 miles, visible from enormous distances, generating their own weather and their own killing winds. The animals sharing this landscape were unlike anything alive today. Herds of woolly mammoths crossed the grasslands. Short-faced bears, larger and faster than any bear alive today, patrolled the same landscape. Scimitar cats carried serrated fangs, built for bringing down prey the size of horses. And the people themselves may have been among the most isolated humans who ever lived. Genetic evidence suggests the founding population of the Americas may have numbered only a few hundred individuals, smaller than a village. Cut off from the rest of humanity for thousands of years, and already becoming genetically distinct from every population on Earth. Then there is the mystery. Human footprints have been found thousands of kilometers farther south, dated to this same period of the Ice Age, in places that should have been unreachable, in places no known route appears capable of explaining. Every indigenous nation that would one day exist across North and South America traces its ancestry back to this small population moving across a frozen grassland that no longer exists. Today, we follow that journey from the land that no longer exists into the continent waiting on the other side. A map of the modern world cannot show the place these people called home. The land itself has disappeared beneath the Bering Sea, where rivers, broad valleys, seasonal camps, and well-traveled paths now rest under layers of seafloor sediment. Every fire that once flickered across its plains belongs to a landscape hidden below the water, leaving only fragments preserved in geology and memory carried through science. At its greatest extent, this grassland stretched almost 1,000 kilometers, that is nearly 621 miles, from one side to the other. It was far more than a narrow strip joining two continents. The region formed a true subcontinent, larger than Iran and comparable in area to Australia. Dry air crossed open country filled with grasses, sedges, flowering herbs, and low shrubs. Although the climate remained cold, deep snow covered surprisingly little of the ground because enormous amounts of moisture had become locked inside continental ice sheets elsewhere, allowing hardy vegetation to flourish across remarkable distances. This productive environment supported an abundance of life rarely matched in the North today. Scientific estimates suggest the total biomass of large animals may have reached nearly 30 times that of the same region in the present age. Woolly mammoths wandered steadily between feeding grounds, while steppe bison, larger than any living bison, grazed across the same plains. Ice Age horses traveled alongside camels and musk oxen. Cave lions watched these herds with patient attention. Dire wolves moved together across the landscape. Short-faced bears claimed feeding sites through sheer size, and scimitar cats relied on powerful forelimbs and curved teeth to bring down heavy prey. For the people who lived here, this world was completely familiar. Some communities occupied the grassland for as long as 15,000 years, enough time for every valley, stream, migration route, and changing season to become woven into collective memory. Children grew into adulthood carrying knowledge gathered across hundreds of generations. They learned where animals crossed rivers, how changing winds signaled approaching weather, and which places offered shelter when conditions shifted. Every lesson survived through conversation, observation, and shared experience instead of written records. The southern horizon offered little promise of easy travel. Two immense ice sheets, the Laurentide ice sheet and the Cordilleran ice sheet, covered most of what is now Canada. Together, they formed an almost continuous frozen barrier. In places, the ice reached nearly 4 kilometers thick, which is about 2.5 miles, pressing down with astonishing weight and leaving no broad opening that people or migrating animals could follow toward the lands beyond. Life continued between these natural boundaries for countless generations, yet the balance holding this homeland together had begun to change. The ocean advanced little by little as melting glaciers returned water to the seas, trimming the edges of the grassland century after century. The familiar country that had shaped these families was gradually becoming smaller. Behind them, rising water reclaimed the plains. Ahead stood walls of ice. Between those opposing forces remained the only world they had ever known, a homeland approaching its final chapter. Across thousands of years, the greatest record these people left behind was carried inside their own cells. Long before stone tools were buried or camps disappeared beneath the sea, their inherited biology began preserving a story that would remain readable far into the future. Modern studies of deoxyribonucleic acid reveal that about 25,000 years ago, the ancestors of every indigenous people in the Americas separated completely from the rest of Eastern Asia. From that point onward, their history followed a path unlike any other population on Earth. Once that separation occurred, contact with neighboring groups faded away. Generation after generation lived without meaningful exchange of inherited traits from populations farther west. Small differences accumulated through time, gradually shaping a community that became genetically distinct through isolation alone. Their appearance, traditions, and daily lives remained tied to the grassland around them, while within every child, a unique biological record continued growing, almost unnoticed across centuries. One remarkable discovery helped to illuminate their deeper ancestry. Near Lake Baikal in Siberia, archaeologists uncovered the burial of a young boy who lived about 24,000 years ago. His inherited traits revealed connections reaching across both Eastern Asia and populations farther west in Eurasia. This discovery showed that the founders of the Americas did not descend from a single isolated source. They already carried a rich mixture of ancestries created through earlier movements across northern Asia, long before the long period of separation began. Researchers describe this prolonged chapter as the Beringian standstill hypothesis. According to evidence drawn from mitochondrial deoxyribonucleic acid, complete genome sequencing, and demographic modeling, these families may have remained on the great northern grassland for as long as 15,000 years. They neither expanded into the continents beyond nor returned to the lands their ancestors had once occupied. Life continued within familiar hunting grounds, while the surrounding world shifted almost imperceptibly across the passing millennia. Those 15,000 years represent roughly 600 generations. 600 times children were born, grew into adulthood, raised families of their own, and eventually became ancestors remembered only through stories. None of them knew another hemisphere waited beyond the southern ice. Their attention rested upon changing seasons, migrating animals, shared traditions, and the ordinary work of survival. History would later describe this era as a standstill, although daily life itself never stood still for those living through it. During this prolonged separation, More than 20,000 unique genetic variants emerged within the population. Scientists have identified approximately 20,424 inherited variations that appear in indigenous peoples throughout the Americas, while remaining absent or extremely uncommon elsewhere in the world. Few events in human history produced such a distinctive biological signature. Only the much older population bottleneck following humanity's departure from Africa created a comparable pattern of inherited uniqueness across so many generations. For the people themselves, none of these invisible changes carried any meaning. They hunted across familiar plains, celebrated births, mourned losses, buried loved ones, taught children, and passed knowledge from one generation into the next. Without realizing it, every lifetime added another thread to a biological record that endured far longer than footprints, shelters, or even the grassland that had become their home. The journey that eventually carried these families into a new continent began long before anyone took the first step south. It was prepared through thousands of years of practice, refined by repeated winters, demanding landscapes, and the steady passing of knowledge from one generation to the next. Every challenge they had already overcome became part of the foundation that allowed them to survive a path no human community had followed before. Among their most valuable achievements was the ability to create clothing fitted closely to the body. Bone needles recovered from upper Paleolithic sites across Siberia show that people of this era stitched layered garments from animal hides with remarkable precision. Loose coverings could not preserve enough warmth in severe conditions. Tailored clothing trapped pockets of insulating air, helping people survive temperatures approaching negative 40 degrees Celsius or negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit, while continuing to travel, hunt, and care for children through the coldest seasons. Obtaining food demanded cooperation on a remarkable scale. Bringing down a woolly mammoth weighing around 6 metric tons required careful planning, patience, and complete trust within the hunting group. Individuals spread across the landscape with different responsibilities, guiding the animal's movement, limiting possible escape routes, and striking only when every participant understood their role. Such hunts reflected traditions refined over many generations instead of decisions invented in a single moment. The same landscape required constant awareness of every living creature nearby. Tracks pressed into damp ground revealed which animals had passed during the night. Broken branches, disturbed grasses, and shifting scents carried by the wind offered clues about dangers beyond immediate sight. A short-faced bear or a scimitar cat could appear with little warning, making careful observation part of everyday survival. Knowledge of animal behavior became as valuable as any tool carried in the hand. Food did not always come from the grassland itself. Archaeological evidence suggests these northern communities also gathered fish, shellfish, and marine mammals whenever coastal resources became available. Such flexibility widened the range of environments they could occupy and reduced dependence upon any single source of food. That adaptability later became invaluable whenever inland hunting proved uncertain or seasonal conditions changed unexpectedly. Fire demanded equal attention. Producing a flame represented only the beginning of the task. Fires required protection from powerful winds, steady supplies of fuel, and careful movement whenever families relocated. Freshly harvested meat needed prompt cooking before freezing solid, while warm embers often traveled with the group to spare the effort of starting again from nothing. Experience transformed fire into a dependable companion across changing landscapes. None of these skills existed in isolation. Every route, dependable water source, seasonal campsite, and animal migration lived within human memory instead of written maps. Stories carried directions. Daily routines preserved practical lessons. Elders became living libraries whose experience could determine whether a journey succeeded or failed. By the time the first travelers turned toward unfamiliar country, they carried far more than tools and provisions. They carried thousands of years of accumulated knowledge, perfectly suited to accompany them into a world no earlier generation had ever reached. A homeland can change without anyone noticing the moment it begins. Each spring resembles the last. Each familiar valley still offers recognizable landmarks, and each generation believes the country surrounding them is much the same as the one their grandparents knew. Across many centuries, however, small changes accumulate until memory and reality no longer match. The people living upon the northern grassland found themselves inside one of those long transformations, shaped by forces no hunter or storyteller could control. The first signs arrived from the edge of the sea, as immense ice sheets across the northern hemisphere slowly released their frozen water. The oceans expanded little by little. No family watched the shoreline advance across a single season. No child grew into old age seeing the entire change. Even so, the western margins of the grassland yielded steadily to the rising water. Rivers reached the sea through shorter valleys than before, and camps once placed safely inland gradually disappeared beneath advancing waves. The interior landscape also shifted. For thousands of years, the dry climate had favored grasses, sedges, herbs, and low vegetation capable of supporting enormous grazing animals. Gradually, increased moisture altered that balance. Shrubs and mosses spread across ground where broad grasslands had once flourished. Such changes unfolded almost invisibly within one lifetime. Yet over many generations, they reshaped the food available to mammoths, steppe bison, horses, and other great herbivores whose movements had guided human life for countless centuries. Hunters experienced these changes through absence rather than spectacle. Valleys that had almost always produced mammoth herds became less dependable. Familiar migration paths drifted toward new feeding grounds. Some years remained generous, while others demanded longer travel before suitable prey appeared. Every successful hunt required greater patience, wider exploration, and deeper knowledge. The land continued providing, although each passing generation worked harder to receive the same rewards their ancestors had once expected. Pressure gathered from several directions at once. The sea continued reducing the western boundary of the homeland. Ice still blocked movement toward the south. Productive grazing country occupied a smaller portion of the landscape than before, encouraging both animals and people to concentrate within shrinking areas that still supported dependable life. Communities adapted repeatedly, although every adaptation narrowed the number of choices available for the future. Then the climate changed with unusual speed. Around 14,700 years ago, a warming episode known as the Bowling-Alarod interstadial raised temperatures across much of the northern hemisphere within only a few decades. Glaciers that had remained stable for thousands of years began retreating along their southern edges. The frozen barrier did not disappear, yet its shape altered enough to reveal possibilities that had previously remained closed beyond walls of ice. No council declared the beginning of a great migration. Families responded gradually, each according to circumstances unfolding around them. Small groups followed familiar herds into unfamiliar country. Others explored stretches of coastline newly accessible after changing ice conditions. They moved because movement had become the most practical response to a homeland that no longer remained constant. Behind them, the grassland continued, surrendering itself to the sea. Ahead lay only a narrow opening, uncertain yet real, inviting inherited knowledge to take its first careful steps into a world that had only just become reachable. Every horizon offered only uncertainty. The opening that had appeared beyond the retreating ice did not reveal a welcoming landscape or an obvious passage. It presented two possible ways forward, each demanding extraordinary endurance. Neither route promised safety. Each carried its own hazards, and every family that chose either path accepted risks impossible to measure before the journey began. One route traced the Pacific coastline, where the edge of the continent met an ocean crowded with floating ice. Great glaciers reached the water and released towering walls of frozen stone into the sea. Icebergs drifted through narrow channels where powerful currents twisted between rocky shores. Storms gathered with little warning, and dense fog often erased familiar landmarks. Those traveling this way likely depended upon carefully built watercraft, moving from sheltered shoreline to sheltered shoreline whenever conditions allowed. Their progress demanded patience, careful observation, and an intimate understanding of tides, winds, and coastal animals that could provide food when inland hunting became impossible. Evidence from islands lying off what is now California demonstrates that these early people eventually crossed stretches of open water to places that had never been connected to the mainland, confirming that watercraft formed part of their survival. The materials from which those vessels were made have vanished through time. Whether fashioned from wood, animal hide, or other natural resources, none have survived to answer every question. Their appearance remains unknown, yet their success is written across the geography they eventually reached. The second possibility unfolded through the continent itself. As the Great Laurentide Ice Sheet and Cordilleran Ice Sheet withdrew, a corridor gradually appeared between them. This passage extended across what is now Alberta, offering a route toward lands beyond the frozen barrier. At first, however, the corridor resembled a newly uncovered scar across the landscape. Freshly exposed ground supported little vegetation. Streams shifted through unstable soil, while powerful winds swept across country only recently released from thousands of years beneath ice reaching nearly 4 kilometers thick, that is nearly 2.5 miles. Plants slowly established themselves across this corridor, followed by grazing animals and the predators that hunted them. Even so, the earliest travelers entered an environment still assembling its own ecological balance. Food sources remained unpredictable. Shelter was limited. Each stage of the journey depended upon finding enough resources to continue before supplies disappeared behind them. The landscape itself remained young, changing from one generation to the next as melting ice reshaped rivers, lakes, and valleys. Despite their differences, both routes shared one irreversible truth. Returning became increasingly difficult once the journey began. The homeland behind them continued shrinking beneath advancing seas, while the barriers surrounding every possible path offered few opportunities to retreat. Progress, however uncertain, became the most practical choice available. Those who advanced along the coast and those who entered the interior almost certainly never believed they were accomplishing something that would reshape human history. They followed animals, weather, memory, and experience accumulated across countless generations. Each camp, each river crossing, each shoreline landing, and each careful step across newly revealed ground carried them farther into places where no earlier human footprints waited. Their knowledge reached beyond the edge of the familiar, allowing inherited skill to guide them through landscapes that belonged to no remembered story. Along the margin, where land dissolved into sea, another possibility unfolded. It was never a broad highway in the familiar sense, nor a marked route waiting to be discovered. It existed as a living chain of connected ecosystems stretching around the Pacific Ocean, one shoreline blending into the next. Today, researchers call this network the Kelp Highway because forests of giant brown algae supported an astonishing variety of life, creating dependable food wherever the tangled fronds flourished beneath the waves. Within those underwater forests lived fish, shellfish, seabirds, marine mammals, and edible coastal plants, each linked to the next through an intricate web of survival. A traveling community did not need abundant game upon every shoreline if the sea itself continued providing nourishment. Conditions remained demanding, and danger never disappeared, yet the coastal ecosystem offered something priceless. Wherever healthy kelp forests spread across the shallows, food rarely vanished completely. The journey remained survivable because the living chain continued across thousands of kilometers, that is nearly 6,214 miles, following the curve of the Pacific coast. The route likely began near the southern edge of the Great Grassland and continued along what are now Alaska, British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, and California. Progress depended upon reaching scattered stretches of ice-free coastline known as refugia, places where glaciers had withdrawn far enough to expose beaches, rocky coves, or sheltered inlets. These small pockets became resting places where families could repair equipment, gather food, and wait for weather favorable enough to continue. Between those refugia stretched obstacles, unlike anything found on ordinary coastlines. In many places, immense glacier walls descended directly into the ocean. There was no beach on which to land, no protected shore where travelers could pause, and no simple detour across solid ground. The only passage lay across open water in carefully maintained watercraft built from materials that have long since disappeared. Every crossing demanded judgment shaped through generations of experience because a mistake offered little chance for recovery. The glacial margin produced weather of its own. Powerful downslope winds rushed from towering ice fields toward the sea, driving steep waves across narrow channels already crowded with floating ice. Dense fog concealed reefs, islands, and glacier fronts until they emerged without warning. Safe travel depended upon observing the rhythm of the ocean itself. Swell direction revealed distant storms. Current patterns hinted at underwater hazards. Marine mammals often followed reliable passages through complicated waterways, while subtle changes in water color and temperature signaled shifting conditions that experienced travelers could recognize before danger fully appeared. Archaeological discoveries at Monteverde in present-day Chile preserve fragments of kelp within hearths dating to approximately 14,500 years ago. That site lies nearly 15,000 kilometers from the northern entry region, which is about 9,320 miles. Those preserved remains reveal more than a meal. They demonstrate enduring familiarity with coastal resources carried across an immense distance through inherited knowledge and repeated practice. Ironically, the route that may have carried the earliest travelers has become one of the hardest to study. Rising seas submerged the campsites they left behind beneath approximately 60 to 130 meters of water. The shoreline that once guided countless footsteps now rests beyond ordinary reach, leaving scattered traces while the ocean protects much of the journey from view. Far from the waves, another doorway into the continent emerged with almost no sign that it welcomed life. Between the Laurentide ice sheet and the Cordilleran ice sheet stretched a narrow opening carved by retreating ice, extending for hundreds of kilometers, which is about 124 miles, between towering frozen walls. Its floor consisted of freshly exposed glacial till, loose rock ground stone into powder, and unstable sediment that had rested beneath enormous ice sheets for countless generations. This was no green valley waiting for travelers. It was a landscape only beginning to exist. The corridor first became physically open around 13,800 years ago, yet being open did not mean it could support people. Studies of ancient sediment recovered from lakes and wetlands inside the passage reveal an environment almost empty of life during its earliest stage. Trees had not arrived. Shrubs remained scarce. Vegetation covered only scattered patches, leaving little nourishment for grazing animals. Without plant life, large herds could not establish themselves, and without dependable game, human families faced a passage offering almost nothing to gather or hunt. Air flowing through this newly uncovered canyon created another challenge. Dense cold spilled continuously from both ice sheets, accelerating through the narrowing landscape like water through a channel. There were few hills, forests, or rocky barriers capable of weakening its force. Travelers moving across the exposed ground faced wind carrying fine glacial dust and bitter cold across remarkable distances. Every camp required careful placement, every fire demanded constant attention, and every day's progress depended upon reading conditions that shifted with remarkable speed. Gradually, the corridor changed. Hardy grasses and sedges reached the southern end first, taking root in fresh sediment left behind by melting glaciers. Shrubs followed as soil slowly developed. Larger plants appeared after many generations, creating habitats that attracted grazing animals searching for new feeding grounds. Predators tracked those herds, and people eventually traced the same expanding chain of life. The corridor transformed step by step, each season adding another layer to an ecosystem assembling itself across ground that had recently emerged from beneath ice. This gradual timeline explains an important archaeological puzzle. Evidence from Cooper's Ferry in present-day Idaho shows that people occupied the region approximately 15,800 years ago, long before the corridor became suitable for sustained travel. Those earliest inhabitants, therefore, almost certainly reached the continent by another route. The interior passage belongs to a later chapter, one that expanded human settlement after environmental conditions became increasingly favorable. Many researchers associate that later movement with the Clovis tradition, recognized through finely crafted fluted stone spear points found across much of interior North America. These distinctive tools appear across an enormous region within only a few centuries, suggesting rapid movement through newly available landscapes. Their distribution matches the opening of the corridor remarkably well, spreading outward from the continental interior as families explored territories that had remained inaccessible for thousands of years. For those emerging from the southern end, every horizon promised unfamiliar possibilities. Beyond the frozen canyon stretched rivers, grasslands, forests, and animals unlike those known within the icy passage behind them. No memory preserved the shape of this country, because no ancestor had described it before. Each camp, each hunt, and each step carried people farther into a continent that entered human experience, one landscape at a time. Crossing into the continent marked no final arrival. It opened the first page of an even longer passage, one that stretched beyond every distant horizon. Whether families entered along the Pacific shoreline or emerged through the interior corridor, they soon discovered that the land before them continued without any visible boundary. Each season revealed another valley, Another river, another mountain range, extending the journey farther than any memory could have imagined. North America was not a single landscape waiting to be explored. It unfolded as a succession of entirely different worlds, each demanding its own understanding. Subarctic forests gradually replaced the northern tundra. Broad temperate grasslands spread across immense plains. Farther south came dry deserts, shaped by relentless sun, followed by subtropical woodlands and humid tropical forests filled with unfamiliar sounds and scents. Every region carried its own rhythms, offering opportunities that existed nowhere else while presenting challenges unlike those left behind. Knowledge gathered across thousands of years on the Beringian grassland remained valuable, yet it could no longer answer every question. Hunters learned the habits of unfamiliar animals whose movements followed different seasons. Gatherers distinguished nourishing plants from poisonous lookalikes through careful observation passed from one generation to the next. Rivers behaved differently. Storms arrived with unfamiliar patterns, and predators occupied places where none had existed before. Survival depended upon noticing subtle details, remembering successful choices, and abandoning practices that no longer fit the surrounding world. This remarkable flexibility reflected the long history that had shaped these people before they ever reached the continent. Countless generations had already lived through dramatic environmental change, preserving practical knowledge through stories, shared experience, and patient instruction. That inheritance encouraged careful adaptation instead of rigid tradition. Groups capable of learning unfamiliar landscapes continued onward, while those unable to adjust left fewer descendants. Over time, successful discoveries became part of collective memory, carried forward alongside tools, language, and family bonds. The pace of this expansion continues to surprise archaeologists and genetic researchers alike. Current evidence suggests that movement from the northern entry region to the southern tip of South America may have required only between 1,000 and 2,000 years. Such a span represents many human lifetimes, yet on the scale of continental history it unfolded with astonishing speed. Communities were not rushing toward a destination they already knew existed. They advanced because each successful season encouraged another journey beyond the next horizon. Measured across the entire distance, this migration covered roughly 15,000 kilometers, that is nearly 9,320 miles, to 18,000 kilometers, which is about 11,185 miles. Those travelers crossed subarctic environments, boreal forests, temperate plains, deserts, tropical rainforests, towering Andean mountains, and the windswept Patagonian steppe. Averaged across the generations, their progress amounted to approximately 10 kilometers, which is about 6.2 miles, each year. Such movement appears modest when viewed one season at a time, yet over centuries it carried people from one end of the Western Hemisphere to the other. The most convincing explanation for this extraordinary spread lies in the movements of the great animal herds. Grazing mammals shifted as changing climates altered vegetation across the continent. Human communities followed the same pathways, guided by dependable sources of food and the accumulated experience of skilled hunters. Herds advanced into fresh grazing lands, families advanced after them, and the journey continued through an enduring partnership between people, animals, and landscapes that kept unfolding toward the south. No bundle resting on a shoulder matched the value of what traveled inside human memory. The greatest cargo crossing into the Americas could not be dropped on the ground, washed away by rivers, or lost during a storm. It existed within conversations, careful demonstrations, repeated practice, and stories shared beside evening fires. Every generation inherited this invisible collection, adding new discoveries before passing it forward to children who would someday continue the journey beyond familiar horizons. Hunting knowledge formed one of its strongest foundations. Success depended upon far more than courage or physical strength. Hunters learned which animals offered dependable food and which carried dangers that outweighed any reward. Tracks pressed into damp soil, snow, sand, or leaf litter each revealed different information. A successful drive across open grassland demanded different coordination than pursuing game through forests, where visibility vanished between trunks. Every harvested animal also required careful butchering, preservation, and storage. So valuable meat remained edible through changing climates, ranging from Arctic cold to tropical warmth. Plant knowledge expanded wherever people settled. A landscape that appeared unfamiliar gradually revealed nourishment, medicine, and danger to those patient enough to observe it. Leaves, roots, berries, bark, and seeds changed appearance with the seasons, requiring careful recognition throughout the year. Some plants became valuable only after roasting, soaking, grinding, or drying removed harmful compounds that would otherwise cause illness. Excavations at Monte Verde, dated to approximately 14,500 years ago, uncovered preserved medicinal plants, demonstrating that sophisticated botanical understanding had already become an essential part of daily life far from the northern homeland. Water demanded equal attention because survival depended upon recognizing trustworthy sources before thirst became overwhelming. Coastal environments surrounded travelers with salt water that could never satisfy human need. Inland landscapes presented different challenges as streams changed course, seasonal pools disappeared, and underground springs revealed themselves only through subtle signs in vegetation and terrain. Families learned to notice those patterns, preserving practical knowledge that often determined whether a campsite could sustain life for another day. Fire represented another inheritance refined across countless generations, creating a flame marked only the beginning of its value. Fire required protection from rain, strong winds, mountain conditions, and changing elevations as the migration continued across diverse climates. It cooked food before spoilage could begin, hardened wooden tools, warmed shelters, and offered light during long nights. Maintaining a dependable fire through unfamiliar environments became a discipline strengthened through repetition instead of chance. The sky also contributed guidance. Experienced travelers recognized familiar stars, prevailing winds, the seasonal movements of seabirds returning toward land, and the direction of ocean swells carrying information from coastlines beyond sight. None of these observations functioned in isolation. Together, they formed a practical language describing movement across landscapes where no written maps existed and no previous traveler had marked the safest path. Holding every skill together was social knowledge, perhaps the most valuable inheritance of all. Communities needed ways to resolve disagreement, decide when to remain or continue onward, share responsibility during hardship, and absorb unfamiliar discoveries without losing cohesion. Every useful lesson became part of the group's shared understanding through speech, memory, and example. Nothing was written. Everything crossed the continent because people carried it within themselves. Some discoveries speak through stone tools, scattered bones, or fragments of charcoal. This one speaks through footsteps. Pressed into the damp shoreline of a vanished lake, each print preserves a single ordinary moment that somehow survived beyond 20,000 years. Together, they form one of the most personal records ever uncovered from the earliest chapter of human life in the Americas. During the height of the last glacial maximum, the basin that is now part of New Mexico held a broad freshwater lake known as Lake Otero. Along its muddy margins, people walked as they carried children, gathered food, searched the shoreline, or traveled between familiar places. Soft sediment captured every step before fresh layers settled above it, sealing those impressions until erosion revealed them once more. The result is not a single pathway frozen in time, but repeated visits preserved across multiple layers, each representing different days separated by intervals that stretched across years or even generations. The footprints belong to people of every age. Some were left by adults moving with long, confident strides. Others came from children whose smaller feet pressed unevenly into the wet ground. A few are so tiny they could only have belonged to toddlers. Weight distribution, balance, and walking patterns match those of children alive today with remarkable precision. The shape of the human foot has remained fundamentally unchanged across roughly 23,000 years. Looking at these tracks creates an unexpected closeness between distant lives and our own, reducing an immense span of time to the familiar rhythm of ordinary movement. Other travelers shared the lakeshore. Giant ground sloths crossed the same mud, leaving broad impressions that still survive beside those of humans. In several places, the paths intersect. One remarkable sequence suggests a sloth reacted after encountering human tracks, rising onto its hind legs before changing direction. Whether the animal sensed nearby hunters or merely investigated unfamiliar scents cannot be known, yet both species occupied the same landscape within the same passing hours. Predator and prey, observer and observed, each left a record that remained together long after both had disappeared. The age of these footprints transformed discussions about the first settlement of the Americas. Independent radiocarbon dating of preserved plant seeds, combined with optically stimulated luminescence dating and separate analysis of quartz grains, converged on an age between approximately 21,000 and 23,000 years. Multiple scientific methods, reaching the same conclusion, strengthened confidence that these impressions truly belong to the height of the last glacial maximum, thousands of years before the appearance of the Clovis culture, and well before any widely accepted inland passage had become reliably usable. Repeated layers of tracks reveal something even more significant than a single arrival. Families returned again and again. This lakeshore belonged within the pattern of everyday life. Children grew. Adults traveled familiar routes, and the ground welcomed their footsteps across many seasons. These were not explorers passing through an empty wilderness. They were people living where conventional timelines once insisted no human community could exist. Exposure has brought discovery, yet it also begins destruction. Wind, rain, and changing temperatures gradually soften the prints that endured beneath sediment for millennia. Each season claims another small part of the record before every detail can be documented. Even so, those fading footsteps continue carrying an unmistakable message. Human presence in this landscape was real, familiar, and deeply rooted long before later generations expanded across the continents. History sometimes changes through a single discovery. In this story, it changed through many, each one appearing far from the last, each refusing to fit the timeline that researchers had spent generations assembling. Across two continents, evidence emerged piece by piece until the older picture could no longer contain it. Instead of one migration, one culture, and one arrival, the landscape began revealing a far deeper human presence. Far to the south, Monte Verde in present day Chile offered one of the earliest surprises. Dating to about 14,500 years ago, the site preserved wooden tent poles standing where they had once supported shelters. Animal hides survived within waterlogged peat, while hearths contained medicinal plants gathered with clear intention instead of chance. A child's footprint remained pressed into hardened clay, preserving an ordinary step across an extraordinary age. Monte Verde lies roughly 15,000 kilometers. That is nearly 9,321 miles from the northern entry into the Americas. Reaching such a distant place by that time required an earlier beginning than the long accepted Clovis first model allowed. Evidence continued appearing farther north. At Cooper's Ferry in present day Idaho, carefully crafted stone tools, dated to roughly 15,800 years ago, rested beside an ancient river. Their location carried unusual significance. The interior passage between the great ice sheets had not yet become a practical route when these people arrived. A coastal migration fit the chronology far more comfortably, suggesting travelers had already moved south while the inland corridor remained largely unusable. Paisley Caves in present day Oregon added another layer through evidence almost no one expected to preserve. Fossilized human waste retained ancient deoxyribonucleic acid that confirmed human occupation about 14,200 years ago. The genetic material survived where bones did not, providing a rare biological signature that placed people in the Pacific Northwest before the widespread appearance of Clovis technology. An entirely different form of evidence had reached the same conclusion. The discoveries extended across the continent. At Page Ladson in present-day Florida, archaeologists uncovered a mastodon tusk bearing unmistakable stone tool marks within an underwater sinkhole. Dating to approximately 14,550 years ago, the site demonstrated that people had already crossed North America and reached the Atlantic side remarkably early. Meanwhile, Buttermilk Creek in present-day Texas revealed stone tools around 15,500 years old. Their craftsmanship differed from Clovis points, suggesting a technological tradition that existed before Clovis and may even have contributed to its later development. Then came the footprints preserved near the former shores of Lake Otero. Their age, between approximately 21,000 and 23,000 years, reached back into the last glacial maximum itself. Together with the growing collection of archaeological sites, they expanded the human story beyond what earlier migration models could comfortably explain. Nearly every one of these discoveries encountered determined skepticism when first announced. Researchers examined the dating methods, questioned the excavation techniques, and searched for alternative explanations. Repeated testing strengthened the evidence instead of weakening it. Seen together, the sites describe a gradual process unfolding across thousands of years. Small groups entered at different times, explored different landscapes, and continued moving through a continent whose horizons stretched farther with every generation. A continent can exist for millions of years without ever witnessing a human step. Rivers carved valleys, forests spread and retreated, glaciers reshaped mountains, and countless generations of animals lived entire histories without encountering the kind of hunter that had begun moving south. Whether the newcomers arrived by the coast or through the interior, they entered a place whose living communities had never adapted to people. Every encounter carried the freshness of a first meeting. Across North America, at least 38 genera of large mammals filled the landscape. Their ancestors had evolved through changing climates, volcanic winters, advancing ice, and fierce predators. Their instincts reflected those long relationships. Wolves hunted in coordinated packs, saber-toothed cats relied upon ambush, short-faced bears claimed carcasses through overwhelming size. None of these established threats walked on two legs, carried sharpened stone, or launched weapons from a distance. Human behavior existed outside every pattern these animals had learned across countless generations. The interior grasslands supported Columbian mammoths reaching nearly 4 meters at the shoulder, which is about 13 feet. That is nearly 4 meters, with bodies weighing close to 10 tons. Family groups crossed open country much as elephants do today, shaping vegetation wherever they traveled. Forests sheltered American mastodons, close relatives that browsed leaves and branches instead of grazing grasses. These two great proboscidean species divided the continent between them, each thriving within habitats refined over immense stretches of evolutionary time. Other giants wandered with equal confidence. Giant ground sloths could rear to almost 6 meters in height, which is about 20 feet. That is nearly 6 meters, towering above surrounding vegetation. Their deliberate movements reflected an existence shaped by few successful attacks upon healthy adults. Such enormous herbivores invested energy in strength rather than speed, because the ecological balance had rewarded that strategy for ages. Nearby, the immense short-faced bear still roamed portions of the interior. For people who had survived alongside this formidable predator on the northern grasslands, its familiar outline must have carried memories into an entirely different landscape. Farther south, another collection of remarkable animals occupied environments untouched by human presence. Glyptodonts wandered through woodlands beneath heavy armored shells, carrying massive tail clubs capable of delivering tremendous force. Open country echoed with the movements of terror birds, swift predators that had dominated South American ecosystems for millions of years. Saber-toothed cats continued stalking prey through forests and grasslands, while towering mammals browsed vegetation that had never before been disturbed by human camps or controlled fire. Every valley, shoreline, and woodland contained relationships already functioning without interruption. Seasonal migrations unfolded according to rainfall, flowering plants, and fresh grazing. Predator and prey recognized one another through inherited experience, repeating patterns established long before humans reached these shores. The newcomers entered those rhythms as an unfamiliar influence, gradually becoming another participant within ecosystems that had never anticipated their arrival. The stillness surrounding those first encounters belonged to abundance, not emptiness. Birds crossed the sky without recognizing approaching people as danger. Great mammals continued feeding until experience slowly altered their responses. A continent rich with life greeted its newest inhabitants without expectation, offering landscapes filled with possibilities while remaining entirely unaware that its oldest balance had begun to change. The first hunt unfolded within an ecological relationship that had never existed before. Across the plains and forests, the great mammals recognized wolves, lions, bears, and other familiar dangers. Human beings belonged to none of those inherited memories. The newcomers carried skill refined across thousands of years, while the animals they encountered possessed no instinctive understanding of what those careful movements, lifted arms, or shaped stone points truly meant. That imbalance appears with striking clarity at the Murray Springs site in what is now Arizona. Preserved within layers of earth are the remains of at least one adult mammoth surrounded by distinctive Clovis stone points, the traces of a campfire, and the bones of horses and bison taken during the same period of activity. The evidence suggests an ordinary hunting episode rather than a dramatic massacre. Families gathered food, processed meat, repaired tools, and continued living, unaware that their routine survival would remain visible for almost 13,000 years. Modern experimental studies help explain why those hunts succeeded. Carefully crafted replicas of Clovis spear points have been tested against elephant carcasses, whose hide and muscle provide the closest practical comparison available today. The stone tips penetrated effectively, demonstrating that their makers had developed equipment specifically suited to bringing down enormous prey. Every flake removed during manufacture reflected accumulated experience, with each generation refining methods learned from the one before until craftsmanship itself became a form of inherited memory. Success carried consequences beyond a single meal because mammoths reproduced at a remarkably slow pace. A female typically carried her calf for about 22 months before giving birth, then required another 4 to 5 years before producing the next offspring. Such a life history worked well within ecosystems shaped by natural predators that removed only limited numbers. Sustained hunting, even at modest levels, placed pressure upon populations that could not replace themselves quickly enough. Losing only a few breeding females each year gradually shifted the balance until recovery became increasingly difficult. Nothing suggests that these communities intended to erase the great animals surrounding them. They hunted for nourishment, clothing, bone, ivory, and the many materials required for daily survival. Their choices reflected familiar practices carried across continents, not a campaign against wildlife. The difference lay with the prey itself. Mammoths, horses, giant ground sloths, and many other species had never experienced generations of coexistence with human hunters. They lacked the cautious distances, altered migration routes, and learned vigilance that later animals would gradually acquire wherever people became permanent neighbors. The encounter therefore remained uneven from its beginning. Knowledge accumulated through thousands of years stood opposite creatures meeting that knowledge for the first time. Evolution can shape caution across countless generations, yet it cannot rewrite behavior within a handful of seasons. Ecological balance shifted more rapidly than inherited instincts could respond. Even amid successful hunts, these people marked life with ceremony. The burial, known as Anzac, belonging to an infant boy, laid to rest about 12,900 years ago in what is now Montana, included more than 100 carefully crafted tools covered with red ochre. Grief, remembrance, craftsmanship, and family traveled beside the hunt. The changing continent witnessed not an invading force, but communities building ordinary lives within an extraordinary world. Change arrived unevenly across the continents, almost impossible to notice within a single lifetime. One valley still echoed with mammoth calls, while another had already fallen still. A familiar migration failed to appear one season, then another, until memory began carrying animals that the landscape no longer did. The transformation spread as people expanded into new regions, touching ecosystems that had remained remarkably stable for hundreds of thousands of years. Across North America, the disappearance of the great mammals unfolded as a sequence rather than a single catastrophe. Different species vanished at different moments, although the pace accelerated as human communities occupied more territory. The mainland woolly mammoth, an animal that had endured approximately 400,000 years of changing climates and repeated advances and retreats of continental ice, disappeared by about 13,800 years ago. Ice ages had come and gone without ending its story, yet within the span of human history on the continent, that long chapter reached its conclusion. Other familiar inhabitants followed. The American horse had first evolved in North America millions of years earlier, before spreading into Asia and Europe across the same land connection later crossed by human travelers. After thriving through immense stretches of time, it disappeared from its homeland by around 10,000 years ago. The continent where horses first began their evolutionary journey no longer held wild horses until people reintroduced them thousands of years afterward. The short-faced bear also faded from the record. This imposing predator had survived at least four major glacial cycles, along with the environmental upheavals separating them. Around 11,000 years ago, close to the period when humans had dispersed across much of the continental interior, its presence came to an end. A similar pattern appeared in the dire wolf, whose lineage had persisted for approximately 250,000 years. By about 9,500 years ago, the species had vanished as the large herbivores supporting its existence became increasingly scarce. Farther south, the sequence moved with even greater speed. Evidence from South America indicates that within roughly 1,000 years of confirmed human arrival south of the equator, nearly every major genus of giant land animal disappeared. Giant ground sloths, glyptodonts armored with immense protective shells, native horses, terror birds, and many other remarkable creatures passed from living ecosystems into the fossil record. Landscapes that had supported these animals across immense spans of geological time changed within what amounted to only a few human generations. When viewed together, the scale becomes striking. At least 38 genera of large mammals vanished across the Americas during an interval that geologists would regard as almost instantaneous. Outside asteroid impacts and the five great mass extinctions, Earth offers few examples of biodiversity declining so extensively within such a brief period. Researchers continue examining the balance between human hunting and climatic change, shifting temperatures, changing rainfall, and transforming vegetation certainly influenced wildlife populations. Even so, the chronology remains difficult to overlook. Again and again, continent by continent, the spread of human populations closely parallels the disappearance of the largest animals. The discussion continues because nature rarely follows a single cause, yet the footprints of people and the fading presence of giants remain woven together across the closing pages of the Ice Age. Reaching a place where life was possible never marked the end of the migration. Every successful camp became another point of departure, and every valley opening toward the horizon invited another season of travel. The same rhythm that had carried families across the northern gateway continued without ceremony. Animals shifted with the changing landscape. Food followed those movements, and people followed the paths that remained open before them. Genetic studies and archaeological modeling suggest that the expansion from the northern entrance of the Americas to Tierra del Fuego may have required as little as 1,000 to 2,000 years. That remarkable journey covered approximately 15,000 kilometers, which is about 9,320 miles, crossing nearly every major environment found on Earth. Forests yielded to grasslands. Grasslands dissolved into deserts. Mountains lifted travelers toward thin air, and tropical lowlands unfolded beyond them. The route was never a single road. It became thousands of connected decisions, each one carrying descendants farther from the place where the crossing had first begun. Movement remained practical rather than aimless. Herds continued searching for fresh grazing, rivers opened dependable corridors through unfamiliar country, and coastlines supplied fish, shellfish, and seabirds wherever the sea permitted. Every generation inherited routes discovered by those before them, then added fresh observations gathered through experience. Memory expanded with distance, becoming a map carried entirely within conversation, demonstration, and shared routine. Eventually, the migration reached Tierra del Fuego, separated from Antarctica by approximately 800 kilometers, which is about 497 miles, of open ocean. Even this far southern landscape, shaped by relentless winds, cold water, and short growing seasons, contains confirmed evidence of human presence between approximately 12,500 and 11,000 years ago. By then, descendants of the first travelers had crossed two continents from end to end, continuing until no additional land stretched farther south beneath their footsteps. Their ancestors had walked across the Ice Age grassland, threaded dangerous coastlines or frozen inland passages, entered North America, crossed the equator into South America, climbed the towering Andes Mountains, descended onto the Patagonian steppe, and continued through landscapes that differed almost completely from one another. Every region demanded fresh understanding. Tropical forests rewarded different skills than high plateaus. Coastal deserts offered lessons unlike temperate rainforests. Communities adapted repeatedly, carrying forward only the knowledge that remained useful, while steadily adding new experience gathered from unfamiliar surroundings. Across many generations, those adaptations accumulated into cultural distance. Languages changed as groups settled far apart. Hunting traditions reflected local animals instead of shared ancestry. Plant knowledge became increasingly regional because each environment offered different foods and medicines. Even stone tools gradually reflected local rock and inherited craftsmanship, creating traditions recognizable to archaeologists thousands of years later. When the Great Movement finally slowed, the Americas no longer contained one wandering population. They held hundreds of distinct communities whose ancestors traced back to a comparatively small founding population that may have numbered only a few hundred individuals. The migration had accomplished far more than filling empty landscapes. It had transformed one beginning into an extraordinary tapestry of human cultures, each carrying echoes of the same distant crossing while speaking with its own unique voice. No one standing on the northern grassland could have watched the transformation from beginning to end. The changes unfolded across many generations, each one inheriting a shoreline slightly different from the one remembered by its grandparents. Rivers widened into inlets. Low plains accepted the advancing sea, and familiar paths disappeared beneath water that never withdrew. The homeland that had sheltered the founding population through countless seasons was gradually slipping beyond reach. As people continued spreading farther into the Americas, the landscape behind them was changing with increasing speed. Ice sheets that had locked immense volumes of water onto the continents kept melting, feeding a worldwide rise in sea level. The western edge of the great northern grassland surrendered first. River valleys became estuaries, marshes expanded, and broad plains narrowed as seawater advanced farther inland each century. What had once been a continuous world joining two continents slowly fractured into smaller pieces before vanishing altogether. By approximately 11,000 years ago, the final land connection had disappeared beneath the sea. Water flowed freely between the Pacific Ocean and the Arctic Ocean, covering the last stretch of dry ground that had linked Asia and the Americas. The route followed by generations of travelers no longer existed as a place where families could walk with children, tools, and knowledge carried from one season into the next. The crossing that had shaped two continents had become impossible on foot. The modern Bering Strait still preserves the outline of that vanished passage. At its narrowest point, it measures about 85 kilometers, which is about 53 miles, across, while its shallowest depth reaches only 55 meters. Compared with most ocean passages, this remains remarkably shallow. That modest depth serves as a reminder that the lost grassland disappeared only yesterday in geological time, leaving the sea to cover landscapes where rivers once flowed and grazing animals once wandered. Everything belonging to that world followed it beneath the water. Beringia, the broad northern plain that had supported human communities for thousands of years, vanished from sight. Campsites, hunting grounds, river crossings, family hearths, and burial places all settled beneath the Bering Sea. Sediment accumulated above them, preserving traces of lives that modern archaeology can reach only with immense difficulty. Much of that history remains beyond direct observation, resting below cold water where ordinary excavation cannot follow. Human movement across the strait did not end forever. Maritime peoples later mastered the open water, traveling by boat between Asia and North America after the land had disappeared. The ancestors of the Inuit and Yupik belonged to these later migrations, following a different route shaped by maritime skill instead of an exposed plain. Their story formed another chapter, connected to the same region while distinct from the great founding migration. With the grassland submerged, the Americas entered a long period of geographic isolation. Two immense oceans separated the continents from the rest of humanity, preserving thousands of years of independent cultural development. The Northern Gateway had opened during one of Earth's coldest ages, then closed as warmth returned, leaving behind a world forever changed by the people who crossed before the sea erased their path. The travelers left behind very little that human hands can still recover. Fires faded into soil. Wooden shelters returned to the earth. Woven fibers decayed, and countless camps now rest beneath the sea that covered their northern homeland. Even bones surrender to time. One record, however, continued passing from parent to child without interruption, carried inside every living cell, preserving a history no flood could erase. Deoxyribonucleic acid became the archive that endured when nearly everything else disappeared. Each generation inherited a copy of the one before it, with only small changes accumulating across thousands of years. Those tiny differences became natural markers that allow researchers to reconstruct relationships between populations separated by immense distances and deep stretches of time. The route itself vanished, yet the travelers carried its memory within their own biology. Every indigenous population throughout the Americas traces much of its ancestry to the founding Beringian community. Maternal genetic lineages known as haplogroups A, B, C, D, and X all descend from that small population which had already separated from East Asian ancestors between approximately 36,000 and 25,000 years ago. During their prolonged isolation on the northern grassland, generation followed generation until distinctive genetic patterns emerged that belonged to that population alone. Researchers have identified approximately 20,424 unique genetic variants that became established during those thousands of years of separation. These variants occur throughout indigenous populations of the Americas at frequencies unmatched anywhere else on Earth. They form a molecular signature as distinctive as a fingerprint, recording a long interval of shared isolation before families expanded into entirely new landscapes. No campsite preserves that span of waiting with such completeness, yet every descendant still carries fragments of its record. One child offers an especially remarkable connection across the journey. The infant known as Anzac I Buried in what is now Montana, approximately 12,900 years ago, rested beneath red ochre beside more than 100 carefully crafted tools. His deoxyribonucleic acid links him both to the Malta child of Siberia and to many present day indigenous populations, extending through Central America and South America. A single burial joins the homeland, the crossing, and the farthest reaches of the migration through one continuous family line. Another child reveals a different branch of the same story. The girl known by the name Zake Tianenhe Tide Gai belonged to a population now called the ancient Beringians. Genetic evidence indicates that this lineage separated from the ancestors of other indigenous Americans around 20,000 years ago. While related groups continued southward, her ancestors remained in Alaska, preserving a branch of the founding population close to the place where the Great Migration began. The genetic record also reveals that the settlement of the Americas unfolded through more than one movement. Evidence supports an initial founding population, followed later by ancestors of Na-Dene-speaking peoples, and later still by Paleo, Eskimo, and Inuit communities who crossed open water after the land bridge had disappeared. Deoxyribonucleic acid resolved another enduring question as well. Ancient indigenous genomes from before European contact contain no European ancestry, affirming that the first great journey began in Asia, crossed the drowned grassland, and continued into a continent that became home. Far from the great migration routes, beyond the places where families established new homes and new traditions, another story lingered, almost unnoticed. It unfolded on an island surrounded by Arctic water, where the final members of a celebrated species continued living long after their relatives had vanished from the mainland. Their survival became the last lingering echo of a world already transformed elsewhere. The woolly mammoth disappeared from continental Eurasia and North America by approximately 13,800 years ago. For hundreds of thousands of years, these animals had endured advancing glaciers, warming climates, and repeated environmental upheavals. Their endurance had seemed almost limitless until human hunters entered landscapes where mammoths had never learned to recognize people as persistent predators. Even so, extinction was not immediate everywhere. A small population reached Wrangel Island before rising seas isolated it from Siberia, preserving a remnant while the mainland herds faded from history. Isolation reshaped these survivors. Food was limited, territory was finite, and generation after generation natural selection favored smaller bodies requiring fewer resources. This process, known as island dwarfism, gradually produced mammoths noticeably reduced in size compared with their towering ancestors. They still carried curved tusks, thick coats, and the familiar outline that had crossed countless frozen plains, although each individual demanded less from an island ecosystem that could never support immense herds. Their remarkable survival extended almost beyond belief. Around 4,000 years ago, these mammoths still grazed Arctic grasses, while monumental stone architecture already stood beside the Nile River, writing flourished across Mesopotamia, and bronze tools shaped daily life around the eastern Mediterranean. Human civilization had entered an entirely different chapter, yet the Ice Age still breathed through a small herd feeding under northern skies, separated from the wider world by cold seas and distance. Eventually, people reached Wrangel Island as well. Archaeological evidence suggests the mammoths disappeared within a comparatively brief interval after human arrival. The exact sequence remains debated because the surviving population was already genetically fragile, with limited diversity accumulated through many generations of isolation. Small populations are vulnerable to disease, harsh weather, and random misfortune. Human hunting may have added another burden to a group already living close to its limits. Whatever combination of pressures proved decisive, the final mammoths disappeared, ending a lineage that had walked the earth for hundreds of thousands of years. Their fate formed part of a wider pattern unfolding across the Americas. The short-faced bear survived at least four earlier glacial cycles before disappearing around 11,000 years ago. The dire wolf endured for roughly 250,000 years before vanishing around 9,500 years ago. The American horse, whose ancestors had first evolved in North America before spreading into Asia and Europe, became extinct in its homeland approximately 10,000 years ago. Many centuries later, Spanish ships carried domestic horses across the Atlantic Ocean. Those animals stepped onto a continent where their distant ancestors had first evolved millions of years before. They returned to grasslands that no longer remembered the thunder of native herds. The journey that had once introduced people into a new world had also reshaped that world so completely that one familiar hoofbeat arrived as though it belonged to something entirely new. A path across frozen grassland ended long ago, yet its destination continued unfolding across thousands of years. Every generation carried the memory of movement in ways no traveler could have imagined. Families divided, settled, adapted, and transformed landscapes that stretched from Arctic shores to tropical forests and mountain plateaus. From a founding population that may have numbered only a few hundred people, an extraordinary range of societies emerged within roughly 12,000 to 15,000 years, an interval that occupies only a brief moment in evolutionary history. Distance encouraged difference. Communities separated by forests, deserts, rivers, and mountain chains gradually shaped their own languages, beliefs, and ways of living. Words changed first by small degrees, then beyond recognition. Customs followed similar paths, reflecting local climates, available plants, neighboring animals, and the demands of each homeland. By the time Europeans first reached the Americas, more than 1,000 distinct languages were spoken across the continents, representing dozens of unrelated language families. Together, they formed one of the richest expressions of human diversity anywhere on Earth, all descending from that distant founding population. Knowledge flourished along equally different paths. In the forests of Central America, the Maya developed one of only 5 independently invented writing systems known in human history. Their inscriptions recorded rulers, ceremonies, astronomy, and the passage of time with remarkable sophistication. Far to the south, the Inca governed an empire extending about 4,000 kilometers, which is about 2,485 miles, across the Andes Mountains without a conventional writing system. Instead, carefully arranged knotted cords known as quipu preserved census records, taxation, and historical information through patterns that carried meaning in 3 dimensions. Farther north, another remarkable center rose beside the Mississippi River. Near the location of present-day St. Louis, the city now called Cahokia became one of the largest urban settlements anywhere in the world during the 11th century. Its population exceeded that of contemporary London. At its center stood an immense earthen monument whose volume surpassed that of the Great Pyramid of Giza. Builders achieved this without metal tools, without wheeled transport, and without draft animals larger than a dog, carrying basket after basket of earth until the landscape itself reflected human intention. The plants cultivated across these continents eventually transformed diets around the globe. Agriculture developed independently in the Americas, producing maize, potatoes, tomatoes, cacao, avocados, squash, beans, and hundreds of additional crops shaped through generations of careful observation and selection. Today, these domesticated plants account for approximately 60% of the world's food supply by volume, sustaining billions of people whose daily meals still depend upon knowledge first developed by indigenous American communities. Every city, every cultivated field, every road crossing mountain valleys, every astronomical calendar, every spoken language, and every tradition traced back through countless generations to that distant migration. A crossing that lasted only a small fraction of human history created an entire branch of civilization separated from the rest of the world by oceans for 11,000 years. Within that long independence, people discovered original answers to familiar human challenges, proving that a single journey across a vanished grassland could reshape the future of an entire planet. Every answer uncovered along this journey seems to uncover another layer still waiting beneath it. The broad outline has become clearer with each generation of research, yet several pieces refuse to settle into place. Archaeologists, geneticists, geologists, and climate scientists continue comparing discoveries that sometimes strengthen one another and sometimes pull in different directions. The story remains grounded in evidence, though its final shape is still being assembled from fragments scattered across continents, coastlines, and genomes. Among the most challenging discoveries are the fossil human footprints preserved in what is now New Mexico. Multiple studies place them between approximately 21,000 and 23,000 years old, with the older estimates creating the greatest puzzle. If people truly stood in the continental interior during the height of the last glacial maximum, existing migration models struggle to explain their presence. The coastal route may have been obstructed by heavy ice, while the interior corridor appears unlikely to have supported sustained travel at that stage. Either an earlier passage briefly became available before conditions worsened, or another route existed whose evidence has not yet survived. Another long accepted landmark has also returned to active debate. For many years, Monteverde in southern Chile stood as one of the strongest demonstrations that people reached deep into South America before the Clovis tradition flourished farther north. During the year 2026, renewed examination questioned whether some of the site's oldest dates might be younger than previously accepted. If those conclusions withstand continued scrutiny, one of the principal anchors supporting early settlement chronology will require careful revision, reminding researchers that even celebrated discoveries remain open to testing. Genetic evidence introduces its own unresolved questions. Some analyses suggest a single founding population that gradually diversified after entering the Americas. Other models point toward two, or perhaps three migrations from different Siberian source groups arriving across separate intervals. Each new ancient genome adds another comparison, occasionally reinforcing existing patterns and occasionally revealing relationships that had not been anticipated. Instead of producing confusion, these competing interpretations reveal how much information still rests within bones, teeth, and preserved tissues waiting to be examined. One particularly intriguing branch belongs to the people known as the ancient Beringians. Evidence indicates they separated from the main ancestral population around 20,000 years ago and remained in Alaska while related groups expanded farther south. Their story appears to end within the archaeological record, yet their exact relationship to later populations remains uncertain. Whether descendants survived through communities not yet sampled, or whether that lineage gradually disappeared, has not been established with confidence. The coastal migration presents another enduring difficulty because the evidence itself has almost vanished. Boats built from wood, skin, and plant fibers rarely survive thousands of years, especially after rising seas submerged shorelines where people once launched them. Camps, landing places, and harbors now rest beneath ocean waters, leaving little more than indirect clues. Every newly excavated shoreline, improved dating method, and recovered genome adds another piece to the picture. In that sense, the journey has never truly ended. Each discovery carries it a little farther, allowing the crossing to continue through the patient work of science. The search for the first Americans now unfolds against an unexpected opponent, time itself. Each expedition begins with the awareness that some traces have already vanished, while others may disappear before another field season begins. The record has always been incomplete, yet today it is shrinking in ways that researchers can measure from one year to the next. The story survives, though portions of the archive are slipping away, even as scientists learn new methods to recover it. Along the ancient Pacific shoreline, the greatest concentration of evidence almost certainly rests far below modern sea level. Camps where families prepared food, stone working areas, shell middens, cooking hearths, and carefully stored tool caches once stood beside beaches that no longer exist. Rising seas gradually covered those landscapes after the great ice sheets melted. Many of those former coastlines now lie between 60 kilometers, which is about 37 miles, and 130 kilometers, which is about 81 miles, below the present ocean surface, in terms of vertical depth, beyond the reach of conventional archaeological excavation. This loss is entirely physical. It is possible that some of the strongest evidence explaining how people traveled along the Pacific coast remains buried beneath thick layers of marine sediment. Those sediments conceal the archaeological record while also shielding it from waves, currents, and biological disturbance. The same blanket that preserved these places also makes them extraordinarily difficult to locate. A promising signal detected across the seafloor may represent a campsite, a natural rock formation, or nothing of archaeological importance at all. Researchers continue expanding the capabilities of underwater archaeology. Side-scan sonar reveals subtle shapes across submerged landscapes, while remotely operated vehicles descend where human divers cannot safely work for extended periods. Survey vessels trace valleys that once carried rivers toward the ocean before rising water transformed them into submerged channels. Every expedition covers only a small fraction of an immense coastline, leaving countless kilometers, which is about countless miles in practical scale, still unexplored beneath cold northern waters. Farther north, another archive faces a different danger. Frozen ground across Alaska and Siberia has preserved mammoths, ancient grasses, insects, pollen, and organic tissues through tens of thousands of years. As permafrost warms and begins to thaw, those natural freezers lose their protection. Material that endured since the Ice Age may decay within months after exposure to air, moisture, and microorganisms. Specimens recovered in time provide extraordinary scientific information, yet many more likely disappear before anyone realizes they were present. The footprints preserved within ancient sediments in New Mexico also continue to weather. Wind removes fine grains, seasonal rain softens exposed surfaces, and repeated cycles of drying gradually weaken impressions that endured for thousands of years. Researchers create detailed three-dimensional scans, photographs, and digital models so each footprint remains available for future study, even if the original surface changes beyond recognition. Each discovery, therefore, carries two stories at once, One belongs to the people whose journey shaped an entire hemisphere. The other belongs to the present effort to recover that journey before more of its physical memory fades into the sea, dissolves within thawing ground, or erodes from the landscapes that carried it across the closing years of the Ice Age. There is a map that can never be unfolded again. Its rivers no longer flow beneath open sky, its valleys no longer gather migrating animals, and the plains that once carried generations of travelers now rest beneath cold northern water. The grassland that sustained the founding population through 15,000 years has almost vanished from the visible earth, leaving only a scattering of islands rising above the Bering Sea. Those islands are the highest ridges of a landscape that once stretched across the horizon as a living subcontinent. Everything between those surviving summits now lies below the ocean. Hearths where meals were prepared, stone tools left beside camps, burial places shaped with care, pathways worn by repeated journeys, and riverbanks visited across countless seasons, all disappeared beneath rising seas. Thick layers of sediment settled across the drowned surface until entire valleys became sealed within the seafloor. Much of that landscape rests beneath water ranging from 50 meters, which is about 164 feet, that is nearly 50 meters again in vertical measure, to 90 meters, which is about 295 feet, that is nearly 90 meters in depth across the former plain. The world itself survives, though hidden beneath layers that few instruments can fully explore. Its human voices have vanished even more completely. The language spoken by those who crossed the grassland cannot be reconstructed from memory or inscription. No written record preserved its sounds. No descendant language can be identified with certainty as its direct reflection. The words exchanged beside evening fires, the names given to rivers, the songs carried across open country, and the stories shared with children disappeared together with the land itself. Their absence leaves one of the largest gaps in the history of our own species. The companions of that world have also faded into fragments. Woolly mammoths, short-faced bears, scimitar cats, native horses, and camels once occupied the same plains as the earliest travelers. Their presence now reaches us through frozen remains recovered from permafrost, fossilized bones resting within ancient sediments, and genetic material preserved inside soil that remained frozen across thousands of winters. Each discovery restores a small piece of an ecosystem whose full richness can never again be observed directly. The geography of the crossing has therefore become extraordinarily difficult to follow. Portions of the route remain submerged. The homeland itself rests beneath the sea, and many stopping places along the Pacific margin share the same fate. Archaeologists work with scattered fragments instead of complete landscapes, assembling broad patterns from isolated discoveries separated by great distances and many centuries. One record escaped that erasure. The genetic inheritance carried by the descendants of the founding population continued from parent to child without interruption. More than 20,000 distinctive genetic variants that developed during prolonged isolation remain present in indigenous American genomes. They preserve the demographic history of that vanished homeland with remarkable clarity, even after more than 800 generations have passed. Another inheritance also continues. It lives within communities, languages that endure today, cultural knowledge passed across families, and the enduring presence of peoples whose ancestors completed the crossing. The grassland itself has disappeared from the surface of the earth, yet the journey it made possible still walks among the living. A journey does not truly end when the walking stops. Its longest path continues through memory, through families, and through the steady rhythm of one generation placing its inheritance into the hands of the next. From the moment the founding population separated from its East Asian relatives until the present spans about 25,000 years, reaching across roughly 800 to 1,000 human generations. Every child born along that chain became both an ending and a beginning. Each generation received far more than physical survival. Language passed from one voice to another before sunrise hunts and evening gatherings. Knowledge of changing seasons, edible plants, dangerous animals, rivers, coastlines, and distant mountain passes accumulated through countless observations. Practical skills became tradition, while tradition gradually became identity. Nothing remained fixed. Every generation refined what it inherited, preserving what worked while adapting to landscapes that differed from those known by their ancestors. The years spent in Beringia left one of the clearest biological records anywhere in human history. During approximately 15,000 years of isolation, a relatively small population developed more than 20,000 distinctive genetic variants that spread throughout the community. Those changes remain present in indigenous American genomes today, carrying evidence of prolonged separation with remarkable clarity. Long after camps disappeared beneath the sea and spoken words faded beyond recovery, those molecular patterns continued moving from parent to child without interruption. The crossing into the Americas itself left comparatively little mark within the genome. The migration unfolded across a period too brief to create a similarly distinctive genetic signature. Its greatest consequence came through the founder effect. A relatively small community became the ancestral source for populations that eventually occupied two continents. The extraordinary diversity of peoples who later emerged all began within that compressed genetic inheritance, expanding over thousands of years into countless unique communities. Knowledge expanded just as steadily. Hunting methods adapted to forests, grasslands, deserts, mountains, and tropical valleys. Plant medicines reflected local ecosystems. Navigation changed from inland trails to rivers and coastlines. Astronomy guided planting seasons and ceremonial life. Agricultural knowledge transformed wild plants into dependable crops. Architecture evolved alongside changing environments, while systems of leadership and governance reflected the needs of growing societies. For much of this history, none of it depended upon written records. Human memory served as the library, strengthened through repetition, teaching, and shared experience. The builders of Cahokia inherited foundations laid by ancestors they could never have named. The scholars who refined the Mayan calendar extended observations begun across generations, reaching far beyond recorded history. Farmers shaping terraces high within the Andes improved practices developed over centuries of careful experimentation. Mariners guiding reed boats along the Pacific coast added fresh understanding to knowledge already carried across thousands of kilometers, which is about 9,320 miles of earlier migrations. Every achievement rested upon countless earlier contributions that remained woven into community life. The crossing, therefore, became more than a remarkable movement across changing landscapes. It marked the beginning of a civilizational inheritance that expanded layer upon layer through nearly 1,000 generations. From a founding population numbering only a few hundred people grew societies of extraordinary variety, each carrying forward a portion of the same distant story, while continually adding something entirely new before passing it onward once again. Across approximately 300,000 years of human existence, people crossed deserts, climbed mountain ranges, followed rivers, and sailed toward distant shores. Generation after generation expanded into places their ancestors had never known. Each migration changed both the travelers and the lands they entered. Even so, every earlier movement unfolded within a world where humanity already existed somewhere nearby, or where animals had gradually learned that upright hunters formed part of the natural order. The journey into the Americas belonged to an entirely different category. The first people who crossed arrived in a hemisphere that had never held a human population. Every valley, forest, coastline, and grassland functioned without any memory of people. Herds recognized wolves, bears, and great cats. Birds reacted to familiar predators. None had evolved alongside coordinated groups, carrying finely crafted projectile weapons, planning together, communicating through language, and adapting with remarkable speed. That difference extended beyond wildlife. Earlier migrations eventually connected with neighboring communities, exchanging ideas, materials, stories, and families. Disease organisms also traveled between populations, creating biological relationships that had accumulated over immense spans of time. In the Americas, the first arrivals encountered none of those networks. No villages waited beyond the next river. No distant relatives shared familiar traditions. Every path forward depended upon knowledge carried within the migrating community itself, strengthened through experience gained with each passing season. The landscapes they entered were rich with established ecological relationships. Mammoths grazed alongside other great herbivores. Predators followed ancient hunting grounds. Rivers carved dependable routes across broad plains, while forests and wetlands supported intricate communities of plants and animals. Human beings represented an entirely unfamiliar influence entering that balanced system. Their arrival introduced behaviors that no species had previously needed to anticipate, including coordinated pursuit over long distances, flexible problem solving, and tools that extended the reach of the human body far beyond natural anatomy. Another feature made this episode unlike any other. Once rising seas submerged the land bridge, movement back and forth became profoundly limited. The founding population remained separated from the rest of humanity for thousands of years. Within that isolation, cultures diversified, languages multiplied, and societies developed according to their own histories. The ocean became more than a geographical boundary. It preserved one branch of humanity apart from every other branch across approximately 11,000 years. Nothing comparable unfolded again. Later expansions, whether through agriculture, maritime exploration, or growing civilizations, always entered regions already inhabited by other people. Encounters brought exchange, conflict, adaptation, and shared history, though the stage itself had already been occupied. The conditions that defined the settlement of the Americas, an unpeopled hemisphere, wildlife without human experience, remarkable ecological abundance, and prolonged separation from every other population, belong to one singular moment in the story of our species. By the time people reached the southern edge of the Americas, humanity had completed its planetary expansion. Beyond those distant shores lay only open ocean. Every continent capable of sustaining permanent settlement now carried human footsteps. The crossing into the Americas therefore marked the final occasion when our species entered an inhabited world entirely new to itself, closing a chapter that could occur only once across the whole history of Earth. Among every discovery connected to the crossing, one trace asks for almost nothing from the imagination. It rests in hardened mud, no taller than a human hand, carrying no ornament, no carved symbol, and no written message. A small footprint, preserved beside the margin of an Ice Age lake, has endured while entire landscapes vanished beneath rising seas and countless generations passed beyond memory. That footprint belonged to a child who walked beside Lake Otero in what is now New Mexico approximately 23,000 years ago. At that time, the planet stood within the harshest interval of the last glacial maximum. Ice covered enormous portions of the northern continents, and many researchers once believed the interior of the Americas could not yet have supported human communities. The impression in the ancient shoreline remained patiently beneath layers of gypsum until erosion revealed it again, offering evidence that arrived long after the child who made it had disappeared. The footprint tells only what Earth can faithfully preserve. Its length shows that the traveler was very young, probably still a toddler. The depth pressed into the damp ground gives an estimate of body weight. Nearby prints left by adults reveal that the child moved as part of a family or larger group rather than wandering alone. Multiple trackways crossing the same shoreline indicate repeated visits, suggesting that this place served as a familiar destination instead of a chance stopping point along a single day of travel. Other marks survived beside those human steps. A giant ground sloth crossed the lakeshore, leaving broad tracks whose shape still carries the weight of that vanished animal. The human footprints and the sloth prints occupy the same preserved surface, recording a brief meeting separated by moments or perhaps hours. Two species shared one morning beside the water, each following its own purpose, unaware that one would eventually study the path of the other across a span of 23,000 years. Nothing within those impressions reveals the child's name, voice, or favorite meal. No outline preserves laughter, weariness, or curiosity. The language spoken within that community disappeared long before writing reached the hemisphere. Songs, stories, and everyday conversations faded with the generations that carried them. Only the pressure of small feet remained, pressed firmly enough into damp sediment to outlast climates, changing rivers, and the slow reshaping of continents. The child could not have known that later descendants would spread across forests, deserts, mountains, coastlines, and islands, building societies of astonishing variety. No awareness of history accompanied those steps. The lake formed the whole horizon of that ordinary morning, and each stride belonged to the familiar rhythm of daily life. Great migrations are rarely experienced as great migrations by the people living through them. They unfold one camp, one meal, one family, and one footprint at a time. Today, that small impression carries extraordinary weight without losing its ordinary character. It remains the most intimate witness left by the crossing, reminding us that behind every continent settled, every language spoken, and every civilization that later flourished stood individual lives measured in footsteps. The child vanished into the flow of generations, while the mark beneath one small foot endured long enough to greet descendants separated by almost 1,000 human generations. There came a moment when the long outward movement of humanity reached its natural conclusion. No ceremony marked it, no voice announced it, and no map existed to reveal its significance. A handful of travelers continued onward as their parents and grandparents had done before them. With each valley crossed and each shoreline followed, they approached the final, unoccupied reaches of a planet their species had been exploring for approximately 300,000 years. Humanity began in Africa, where countless generations learned the first lessons of cooperation, language, and survival. From there, people spread into Europe, across Asia, and onward to Australia. Every migration expanded the range of a remarkably adaptable species, yet one destination remained beyond reach until changing climates opened a narrow opportunity. The frozen grassland joining Asia and the Americas became the last great passage, carrying people into the only major hemisphere that had never before known human footsteps. When those families crossed, they completed something far greater than a migration. They finished the first great chapter of human existence, transforming a regional species into a planetary one. Every landscape capable of supporting permanent settlement now held people. Mountains, deserts, forests, grasslands, islands, and river valleys all became part of a single human story, even though the communities themselves remained separated by immense distances and, in many places, complete isolation. Everything that followed unfolded inside that completed world. Agriculture emerged independently in several regions. Cities rose from fertile floodplains and high mountain valleys. Systems of writing appeared, while elsewhere memory alone preserved vast bodies of knowledge across generations. Scientific understanding accumulated, ships crossed oceans, and eventually machines carried people beyond the atmosphere. Those achievements transformed civilization, yet none expanded humanity into a truly untouched continent. The age of discovering a land where no person had ever stood had already reached its final page. The descendants of the founding population demonstrated what such isolation could create across approximately 800 generations. From a community numbering perhaps only a few hundred individuals grew extraordinary cultural richness. Thousands of languages developed from shared ancestral roots. Societies found distinct answers to questions of governance, astronomy, architecture, mathematics, farming, and trade. Crops first cultivated in the Americas eventually nourished populations across nearly every continent, becoming part of daily meals far beyond the lands where they originated. All of that diversity traces back to a crossing through a landscape that no longer exists. The rivers that guided those travelers now lie beneath the sea. Campsites disappeared beneath layers of sediment. Trails faded beneath changing climates. The physical world that supported the journey almost completely vanished, while its consequences continued multiplying across thousands of years, carried by memory, culture, and inheritance instead of stone. None of the people making that passage understood they were completing a planetary expansion. The adults leading children across unfamiliar ground could not know that later generations would build cities, cultivate fields stretching beyond the horizon, or chart the movements of stars from distant mountain observatories. The child whose footprint remained beside the lake carried no awareness that one small step would survive almost 23,000 years. They lived within ordinary days, gathering food, caring for one another, and moving toward places that promised another season of life. From those ordinary choices emerged the completed human world, shaped one journey, one family, and one generation at a time. Nothing remains above the waves of the broad grassland that once joined two continents except scattered islands rising from the sea like distant hilltops. The rivers that crossed those plains have vanished beneath salt water. The camps where families rested, repaired tools, shared food, and welcomed children into the world rest below layers of seafloor sediment. The ice corridor has become farmland. Coastal stopping places that may have guided travelers south now lie beneath approximately 100 meters of water, which is about 328 feet. The animals that once wandered beside those people have disappeared, and the languages spoken across that vanished landscape faded long before anyone could preserve a single word. The journey itself endured in another form. Every Native American genome carries evidence of the long isolation that shaped the founding population before it entered the Americas. More than 20,424 distinctive genetic variants arose during those many generations on the northern grassland, spreading through a community small enough for shared ancestry to leave lasting marks. Mitochondrial lineages, passed from mother to child, continue across more than 800 unbroken generations, preserving a biological record that no rising ocean could erase. Fragments also remain within the ground, footprints impressed into soft mud beside the lake. In present day, New Mexico still testify that families stood there during the height of the last great cold period. Wooden remains preserved at Monteverde speak of shelters built beside flowing water. Carefully shaped stone tools recovered from Cooper's Ferry reveal practiced craftsmanship. Marks left on the bones of a mastodon at Page Ladson suggest people working beside an animal that had already fallen. Each discovery preserves only part of the larger story, yet together they form a pattern that continues growing clearer with every careful excavation. The living record reaches even farther. Hundreds of indigenous cultures still carry traditions rooted in deep ancestry. Languages continue to express ways of understanding the world that developed across thousands of years. Knowledge of plants, rivers, coastlines, stars, weather, and seasonal change has passed through generations by memory, conversation, and daily practice. Much of that inheritance survived without written words, remaining alive because people continued teaching children what earlier generations had entrusted to them. The grassland disappeared beneath rising seas, while everything built upon its foundation continued moving through time. A few hundred travelers became millions of descendants. Communities spread across mountains, forests, deserts, plains, and tropical valleys, adapting to places their distant ancestors could never have imagined. The crossing itself became part of an inheritance carried forward one generation after another, woven into families whose histories stretched far beyond the drowned homeland where the journey began. Even now, the story remains unfinished from a scientific perspective. Each newly recovered ancient genome refines the family tree. Every carefully dated archaeological site adjusts the timeline. Improved methods of studying sediments, fossil pollen, and worn stone tools continue adding detail to events once thought permanently beyond recovery. The passage into the Americas still reveals fresh evidence, reshaping understanding without altering the remarkable fact that people crossed into a new hemisphere and built enduring civilizations there. The doorway through which they traveled rests beneath the sea. The people who crossed it remain present, carrying that beginning forward into every new generation. Viewed across the full sweep of human existence, there comes a moment when the map is finally complete. For almost 300,000 years, people moved outward from their place of origin in Africa, carrying memory, skill, and curiosity across landscapes that stretched far beyond any horizon they could imagine. Generation after generation extended that reach. Europe became home. Asia became home. Tens of thousands of years later, people crossed open water into Australia, accomplishing the first known sea voyage undertaken by our species. At last came the frozen passage between continents, followed by the long movement through the Americas until no farther land remained. The southern shores of Tierra del Fuego marked more than the end of a continent. They marked the final destination of the longest migration ever undertaken by a living species. Beyond those windswept islands stretched only open ocean. Every continent had now welcomed human footsteps. Every climate had become part of human experience. Forest, desert, mountain, grassland, rainforest, tundra, and coastline had all entered the shared story of one remarkably adaptable species. That crossing into the Americas stands apart because it represented the final, genuinely untouched hemisphere reached by humanity. Earlier migrations carried people into regions where other human groups already lived, or where contact would eventually reconnect neighboring populations. The Americas followed a different path. Those first travelers entered lands without another human community waiting beyond the next valley or across the next river. The meeting between people and an entire hemisphere unfolded only once, leaving consequences that echoed across thousands of years. History often celebrates famous voyages made with written records, polished ships, or carefully drawn maps. The crossings associated with Christopher Columbus, Ferdinand Magellan, and voyages beyond Earth's atmosphere occupy familiar places in cultural memory. Their achievements remain extraordinary, yet the deepest act of exploration happened much earlier. It unfolded without written language to describe it, without monuments to commemorate it, and without anyone realizing that they were completing a journey that had begun hundreds of thousands of years before. Those travelers almost certainly did not think of themselves as explorers. They followed migrating animals across familiar hunting grounds. They searched for food, fresh water, shelter, and safer places for their families. Coastlines suggested directions, river valleys invited movement, seasons opened paths, then closed them again. Each decision belonged to ordinary life, shaped by practical needs instead of grand ambition. Even so, every step carried humanity farther into a landscape no person had previously entered. Looking backward from the present, the scale becomes visible. A small founding population crossed a grassland that has since disappeared beneath the sea. Their descendants spread across two continents, developed hundreds of cultures, spoke more than 1,000 languages, cultivated crops that now nourish much of the world, and built societies reflecting countless ways of understanding the land around them. None of that future could have been seen from the frozen plains where the journey unfolded. Without ceremony or deliberate intention, those families completed humanity's first great undertaking. They transformed a species that had once occupied one corner of Africa into one that belonged everywhere on Earth. The grassland vanished. The travelers passed into history, and the path they followed disappeared beneath rising seas. The achievement itself remains, carried forward wherever human beings remember how the world was finally, completely reached. There is a narrow stretch of water today where two continents almost touch. The Bering Strait spans about 85 kilometers, which is about 53 miles, its surface shifting between gray waves and winter ice as the seasons turn. From Little Diomede Island, the coastline of eastern Russia can appear on a clear day, close enough to imagine, separated by water that seems permanent. It is easy to believe this landscape has always looked this way. The sea encourages that illusion, covering an older world with remarkable completeness. Around 55 meters below those waters rests the grassland that once joined Asia and North America. Rivers crossed it, herds wandered across it. Families built lives upon it for roughly 15,000 years, adapting to a homeland that existed between continents instead of belonging fully to either one. They could not have known that rising seas would erase nearly every trace of that place, leaving only distant hilltops as islands above the surface. The land disappeared, though the lives shaped upon it continued long after the shoreline vanished. Far to the south, another fragment endured by extraordinary chance. A small child stepped across damp ground beside Lake Otero in what is now New Mexico. The impression remained in soft sediment, later covered by layers of gypsum that protected it through changing climates and passing ages. Around 23,000 years later, that footprint emerged once more. It fits within human hands, carrying no inscription, no carved symbol, and no spoken memory. It preserves only the unmistakable record of a child who once moved across a lakeshore while adults and other members of the community passed nearby, living another ordinary day. No surviving word tells us what that child called the sky, the water, or the people walking beside them. Their language disappeared long ago, together with countless stories carried only in memory. They almost certainly had no idea that future generations would describe their ancestors as pioneers, migrants, or founders. Such ideas belong to distant centuries. Their world consisted of family, weather, food, movement, and the familiar rhythm of each passing season. One step followed another, linked to thousands that had come before across the drowned grassland. From those ordinary moments grew everything that followed throughout the Americas. Communities expanded into forests, mountains, plains, deserts, and coastlines. Languages multiplied. Knowledge of plants, stars, rivers, animals, and seasons deepened across more than 800 generations. Cities rose, crops transformed diets across the globe. Every branch reached back through an unbroken chain of parents and children to a founding population numbering only a few hundred people, whose homeland now rests beneath the sea. As this story comes to rest, the journey remains present in the world around us. Scientists continue uncovering footprints, tools, campsites, and genomes that sharpen the picture, one careful discovery at a time. Living communities continue carrying traditions that began long before written history. The child beside the vanished lake kept walking without knowing what that path would become. Across thousands of years, the footprints continue to appear, and each one brings the distant crossing into clearer view.